Welcome to Unit 4, the Middle Ages, Section 4, Economic Expansion and Change. In this section of notes, we're going to be looking at how medieval life started changing both economically and in people's everyday life, in their jobs and their lifestyle. A little bit of this will be a little bit of review into Section 3. We'll talk about partnerships and guilds a little bit more, but we're going to be in more depth here. So while those words you've already seen, you're going to see them again, and hopefully they'll give you a little bit more description of that. Okay, so here's our objectives. We still are asking that same question, which is what controls people? And hopefully you've been able to see that the medieval church and the monarchs and the feudal system, these have all been different ways that people have been controlled. But what is commonly happening? What controls people in a civilization? So objective 1, what were the new technologies that sparked an agricultural revolution in the Middle Ages? So there are going to be some new things that happen that make agriculture even easier. We'll go over those. Objective 2, what were the new practices that developed to do a revival in trade during the Middle Ages? So now that we have more goods and more agricultural stuff going on, how can we trade over larger areas with more people, and what are the ways that we can do that? So what are those new practices? And objective 3, what is a guild, and describe the ways a guild increased the rise of a city. So how did guilds help? What are guilds like? What's their purpose? What's their functionality? That's our objectives, okay? Go ahead and pause that if you need to write those down. We'll go on. So in the medieval age, you remember that most people were saying 95% of people are participating in agriculture somehow. The vast majority of people. It takes that many people to feed everyone. And with that happening, some new changes are going to start happening. Okay, for a fairly long time, about 300 years, we're going to start seeing this new spark of technologies that's going to make life easier, better, and more productive for serfs and their vassals and everything else. So some of the new technologies that come out. By the 800s, peasants were starting to use iron plows. So that's a big deal. You can imagine using wood plows or other things like that, or a softer metal even. It's going to get banged up, it's going to break, it's going to have a harder time. So in iron plows, the nice thing is they're stronger, they can stay sharpened. You can really dig into the ground faster, easier, and in larger areas than you were before. Okay, so that's a big one. A new kind of harness allowed peasants to use horses rather than oxen to be pulled. So iron plows are lighter, so you can do more. It takes less effort to dig into the earth, and instead of having a really big beast of burden, you can have lighter beasts of burden, like horses, that can go and make sure that you can do larger areas of land, which equals more crops. And then another invention is going to be the windmill. Windmill is going to be incredibly important as it's going to generate the power to grind the crops that you need to grind. So now we're going to have corn mill, or we're going to grind flour from wheat, and we'll have these new types of ways of grinding, a lot less labor intensive. Rather than sitting there grinding it with your hand or with stone, now you've got a windmill that can sit there and grind it into a nice flour. Okay. So those are the inventions that are going to come about at this time, and it's going to change agriculture in a major way. Okay. As they continue to expand their production, right? They're going to start clearing more and more forests and swamps. They're going to make this room for farming. And again, the reason is they need to be able to have this land for the food. Now, again, review from our last section is one field would be usually planted. It depends on the time period, but the guimes, or here at this point, wheat. Another one would be planted with barley. Another one would be left fallow, where animals could graze and eat and poop and make the soil more fertile. Okay. This is what we call the three-field system. Okay, and we've talked about this already again. And so we're just going to kind of again, we've seen this, so we don't really need to go into more depth about it. It's going to really allow soil and vegetation and fields to continue to be more versatile, to be more rich with nutrition, making more crops, better crops, and fields that don't go, that don't get scorched. They don't get rid of their nutrients. Okay, and with that happening now, more and more people are able to trade. Okay, there's new trade routes that people are going to enjoy as they're looking around. One is going to be the famous Silk Road, right? Caravans will form these new routes and they'll trade with the Chinese. They call it the Silk Road because they are primarily trading with the Chinese silk. Silk is a very, very precious and very hard commodity at that time. Even to this day, silk is a fairly, you know, expensive product to get. The Byzantines had gold and jewelry. The Asians had spices. And this trade route is going to be something that's going to really impact a lot of people. In fact, right, Columbus, the whole purpose of him trying to find an all-water route to the Asian continent, to India, is that he's trying to find a way that they can quickly trade the spices that the Europeans want so badly, without having to go over very dangerous land routes. Okay. And so they started having what was called trade fairs. This is where traders and customers could kind of come. It'd be like a farmer's market. People could come together and they'd have all sorts of different products from all sorts of different places and they could trade different things. A lot of it would still be barter, although you well get money economies, they'll start doing this as well, right? And so you might have a vendor who goes out to Asia, buys a significant amount of spices, for instance, comes back with those spices, then goes to these trade fairs and is trading things that he needs for the spices that he has. Could be gold from the Byzantine Empire, could be silk from the Chinese Empire. Any of these things would be available to them. Okay, so here's just some trade routes. You don't need to know any of these necessarily or anything like that, but looking here at Europe, right? Here we have Italy, here we have, France, and this would be modern day Germany and Spain. And look at all the trade routes that are around. So this is a lot of times I think we think that there's like a road or we think that there's a specific way to trade, but there's a lot of different routes that people are taking to get to these trade routes. Okay, and this would be, for instance, like the Silk Road right here. Okay, to get over to China and to get over to India to get those spices and silk and things like that. So as trade is getting larger and larger, it starts to revive businesses, creates new towns, and these new towns would have merchants who would wait out a winter near a castle or town, and then they would visit. They would be there where customers could come, and they would be able to buy their product. Okay, so as long as you were a merchant, and you could survive the winter. You could then have customers coming, and they would want to trade with you or buy from you the different goods that you had. You are going to get some medieval cities here, okay? This is where, like the medieval cities that we do have, they start to form in these trade centers. Now, to make sure that trade centers, these cities didn't get too powerful or too big, right? Because it's pretty easy to control a manor. When you're out in the middle of nowhere and it serves you and your field and your food, right? It's pretty easy. As people start to, get into one area and start to live in these cities again, they start, there's some threats. Now there's more people together, which means that there's a force that can fight against you. So you got to make sure that these people are doing what you want them to do. So to do that, they'd set up what's called a charter. Town was not allowed to actually exist or function in any way unless it had a charter. Charter was a document. Again, this is just review here, right? A document that let them do certain things, the do's and don'ts of their society. Right? And so here's kind of a more definition for you. A charter is a written document that sets out the rights and privileges of the town. And in return, merchants paid the lord or the king a large sum of money, a yearly fee or even perhaps both. You might say, well, why does the vassal get it? Because it's on his land, right? He's selling it to the people there. It's his land, so therefore he deserves to have, a large sum of money, according to them. As things continue to evolve, we turn from a barter economy to a money economy. And here we have some medieval coins. You can see that they have minted. Merchants needed this money to buy goods that they wanted from other people. Okay, so you had what's called money lenders. This is when we start to see banking coming into play. Okay. What we eventually start calling this is banking houses, and these banking houses would offer exchanging of currency. So if you had this currency and you had this currency, you come to the bank and they would give you the currency that you needed. They're the ones that officially recognize the value of that currency, how much it was worth, and they also were the ones that were giving what's called capital. Capital is money that's invested, that somebody, like if I wanted to start as a merchant and go buy products in Asia, bring them back over here. Well, it's going to cost me money, right? I got to get animals to pull the cart. I got to get a cart. I got to get protection in case I do get attacked. I've got to do the journey itself, so that includes food, shelter, and all those things. I got to actually buy the spices or the silk or whatever I'm going to go buy. All that's what is called capital. It's money that you can get now, and then you can pay back to the bank later with interest. So just like a house, right? I want to live in a house now. I don't want to have to wait until I'm 60 to buy a house. So I save up my money, but then I also can go to a bank and get capital. So this is money that I promise I'll pay back with interest at a different time. Businesses do the same thing. So if your mom and dad, or you even start a business one day, you're going to need money to start that business up. So you can go to the bank. The bank will issue that money as long as you promise to pay it back with interest. You can do that. Okay. So these new business practices going in and everything happening, they're going to start to form what's called partnerships. A partnership was when two merchants would join together to make sure that their business either survived or that was less risk, right? If I take on the risk to the bank myself, that's a lot of capital. Maybe I borrow $300,000 to build a house or to make a business. Well, if something goes wrong, who's responsible for that $300,000? Me, all by myself. Now, I do also get 100% of the profits too, but that's a different part, right? On the other hand, if I am, say, in a partnership, instead of paying that $300,000, now I'm on the hook for only $150,000. It also means I'll share in the profit as well, but it's less risk. Okay, it minimizes that risk. Okay, so under the setup, a group of merchants pooled their funds together. They would finance a trade. That way, they all had a little stake, but not everything. So instead of them forming a business, they'd say, "Hey, so and so, is going to go. Doug, he's going to go to Asia, and he's going to get spices and silk for us. And there's 10 of us here. It's going to cost us this much, rather than all one of us put all that money into it and have this expense and possibly something bad happen. Let's all put our money together. That way, if something does happen, it's only a small portion, not a large portion." This would kind of give an insurance to the merchants that they wouldn't lose everything if something did happen. Merchants then also adopted a bill of exchange. A bill of exchange, again, was the ability to go to a place with money and have it recognized so that I could then transfer it into a different currency or a different money, so that way I could function. I don't want to be carrying maybe large amounts of money on me on my journey, because that's what people are trying to rob and kill me for. So maybe I put it in a bank and I have a bill of exchange, so I can go to the bank that I'm going to and then get that currency out when I get there. It's a little bit safer, right? So under this merchant have deposited money with a banker in his home city. The banker issued a bill of exchange, which the merchant exchanged for cash in a distant city. It made banking a lot easier. So there's also going to be some social changes, new ways of doing business in medieval society. Some of this was what helps get rid of serfdom, gets rid of feudalism, and eventually starts making classes again of, everybody's free, but you have the poor class, middle class, and rich class. Feudal lords needed money to buy fines and goods, and as a result, many peasants began to sell their farm products to pay their rent in cash rather than to labor. Okay. By 1300, most peasants in Western Europe were either what's called tenant farmers, who paid rent for their land, or hired farm laborers. What that means is now there's this incentive to be a peasant. And as a serf, it was nice because you had guaranteed things, right? Guaranteed land, or guaranteed shelter, guaranteed food, all that stuff. But now you start to see less and less of those feudal exchanges where a serf or a peasant becomes a serf because he wants that guaranteed protection. Now you start to see people who are really there to work the land, to labor for that person. And so lords start to see this as I don't need serfs, I just have the land. So I can rent my land out to peasants who can then work. And if I don't like the peasants, I can, hire somebody else and they can work the land for me instead. By, thousands of new different class appeared. We call them the middle class, okay? These were merchants, traders, and artisans, okay? And they're between the nobles and these peasants. They're not working the land. They're not super poor like the peasants are, but at the same time, they're definitely not from the right family. They are not a noble or anything like that. So therefore, they're in this middle class. And it's important that middle class is not nearly as robust as the American middle class today. However, it is going to be wealthier than the poor class as well. Now, nobles and clergy, they despise this middle class because the middle class is going to start taking on airs. They're going to start feeling a little bit more, that they're not as low as the peasants. The peasants, at least, they know they're peasants. They get they're poor. The middle class is going to feel like they're not as low. They're going to feel like they're entitled to certain things, where we're going to start to see basic human rights and basic things like that start. So they're going to feel a little bit more entitled to that. And really, the nobles and the clergy, they hate that. They hate people questioning their power. They hate people who start to feel like they're a little bit better than other people. They don't like that. Okay, so to the clergy, the profits that merchants and bankers made from usury or lending, this is an immoral practice. This is where this idea of Christianity is going to actually outlaw banking. So you're not going to see a lot of Christians be bankers, or if you do, a lot of these bankers are going to give lots of money to the church because they're going to feel very guilty for being bankers or being a part of that. It's going to be kind of seen as a bad business. Okay. In the medieval towns, these merchants and artisans eventually started to realize that as more and more people started to try to become merchants and artisans, it was going to hurt their craft and hurt their profits. So they would start to form a guild, right? A guild is decided in a town that basically helps decide what laws are going to pass and what taxes will be levied. Um, they help these things. This is part of the reason the nobility didn't like them is they start being involved in things that they normally would never have been involved in. Okay. In time, artisans are going to grow angry with these merchants, and they're going to organize what's called craft guilds that represent workers in one of the occupations. So it could be a baker, it could be a cooper, it could be any of those types of occupations. Guild members cooperated to protect their own economic interests. Okay, so they would want things to happen, and they knew the nobility was in charge, so they would try to purposely get on the good side of them so that way their economic interests would be satisfied as well. Okay, now guilds are going to play a very important role. Okay, they are going to help one keep the quality of the goods. What we mean by that is you don't just go get, let's say that you're in the market for a sword. You don't just go anywhere to buy that sword. You go to the best craftsman. It's got a guild stamp on it, which means it's got an approved, um, something that stamps that says, yes, this person is, a part of the guild. They are certified. They know what they're doing. They have the right skill, right? Versus just asking somebody to make a sword and then giving you, kind of a very crappy kind of piece of work. They also regulated the hours of labor, so they determined how long people would be working, and they set the prices too. So this is where instead of me competing with other, blacksmiths or whatever like that, we have a guild, so there's no competition. Now we all have the same price. This helps us, so we don't have to worry about customers going to different guilds and us not having the money. But it also helps customers because now they're not, thinking they're getting ripped off. They can go to one place and it always has the same price. Okay. If you wanted to become a guild member at the age of 7, you would start. This kind of goes in line with knighthood, right? Child might become what's called an apprentice or a trainee. They would serve. So, for instance, Benjamin Franklin was kind of living and doing this kind of system, even though he significantly later passed this system. He worked as an apprentice for a newspaper company for long periods of time until he made his own. Okay, so you first start out as an apprentice or trainee, then you start to work towards like what we call journeyman, and to a guild master, or you'd work under them as an apprentice under a guild master, who the guild master was an expert in his craft, right? As you continue to work on, you'd become what's called a journeyman. This would be you're kind of your own person, but you're working under a guild. So this would be kind of think if you think of construction, it'd be like a general contractor would be like the guild master, and then people who work like hourly rates, who just like you hire or whatever, they're called the apprentices. But the guys who are like in charge, so my painter, my framer, my bricker, my mason, my whatever it is, they are a journeyman. They work for me, but they're their own boss. They're their own thing. And a lot of these men that were journeymen wanted to become guild masters, but it wasn't so easy just to become a guild master. So a lot of them stayed at the journeyman level for most of their lives. This is going to have a big impact on women and the guild system. A woman often engaged in the same trade as her father or husband did, so they would be helpers to whoever it was. So we see that women are going to be working a lot more at this time, although that work is going to be really stipulated upon the male who's with them, rather be a father or husband. They are engaged in that type of work. Women dominated some trades even more than others in other guilds, and some of those could be more like baking, and others could be more like crafts, very elegant crafts and stuff that they would have made at the time. So town life is going to change significantly. It's going to get larger and larger. A typical medieval city is going to be a bunch of buildings in very messy, narrow streets lined with very tall buildings and houses. So, here's some artist depictions of medieval society. You have these buildings, and it kind of almost seems like there's no rhyme or reason. There's lots of little streets and alleyways and stuff like that. And it just is because there's really not any central planning. Like we saw in Rome, Rome had architects, and they design and plan, and the city had their own kind of stipulations of what could or couldn't be made or whatever. At this time period, there's really none of that's happening. You just build buildings, and there's a lot less structures and a lot less things like that. You're not going to have any garbage collectors or sewer systems, so you have tremendous amounts of filth. These medieval cities could be disgusting because people just drop their trash places, and water would get contaminated. This is why a lot of people start drinking alcohol, is because alcohol is a safe drink. As it's been fermented, and as it's been whatever, it's been cleaned, and so it's not such a scary drink as water can be at this time. Water can be very, very contaminated very quickly because there's just no real regulations about people dumping garbage or waste, sewage, or anything like that anywhere they want. So the High Middle Ages is what's going to bring Europe into the contact with civilizations that are going to be much, much more advanced. And as people start to realize, wow, we're not living the way we could be living as some of the other civilizations, like the Byzantium Empire or the Chinese or the Indians, they're going to start to see that medieval society is not really where it could be at. And that's what's going to help spark into the Renaissance. Okay, so that's the end of our notes there. If we come back to our objectives, make sure you've got those all answered. So what are the new technologies that sparked agricultural revolution? We talked about that, right? It's going to be iron plow. It's going to be a new kind of harness that they used on horses rather than oxen. It's going to be windmills. Those are going to be the main technologies. Also, they are going to have the three-filled system that they use with that as well. Okay? So that's going to be the answer to objective 1. Objective 2, what new practices that developed due to a revival in trade during the Middle Ages, right? Talked about caravans, trade fairs, that's a big one. And then another part of that is going to be the capital as well as the exchange, partnerships and bill of exchange. So it'll be the answer to objective 2. And what is a guild, and describe the ways a guild increases the rise of a city. So you can talk about, specifically you can write down what a guild is. Okay, you can write down what a guild is specifically, and then you can talk about how these guilds made cities more, like with trading, more robust. Everybody kind of knew what their job was. Young men would learn where they were going to do for the rest of their lives at a very early age of 7. Apprentice, journeyman, right? It's a place where people can do business together. So this last part here is going to be the answer to that last objective. It's going to give structure to society, apprentices, journeymen, and it's going to be where people can go and make trades with different people to get the products that they need. Okay, so that's going to be the end of that section there. I know some of it was review again from section 3, but I wanted to go into a little bit more depth about certain parts of that. And so there is, economic expansion and change. This will be the end of the Middle Ages for us.